Before we enter our Good Friday worship, I want to take time to thank our readers this evening, Ben Wilcox, Carrie Wilcox, Sarah Erdman, Nate Burheim, and Ainsley Anderson. Special thanks as well to Nancy Hilleran, who plays the guitar and will lead us in the singing of What Wondrous Love Is This. And a dear friend of mine, Noli Kaplinger, wrote a song called Jesus Took the Long Way Home. And she recorded that and sent that to me, and we'll be using that at the end of our service. Again, we thank you so much for the ways that you volunteer and help make our worship special. They say a rooster crowing is God's wake-up call. I think that pretty much sums up the readings for Good Friday. A wake-up call for Peter, for Judas, for the disciples, for the Roman soldiers, the women. Because on that night, everything was a blur for them. No one really understood what had just happened. All I know is that most of them found themselves isolated, unable to be together for whatever reason. And you and I understand what this isolation is like today. Sometimes feeling alone, sometimes caught in our grief, caught in the losses of our lives, missing important connections. We should be thankful that technology we have today, because we can stay connected. Not in the ways we necessarily want to. We prefer the physical connections. But I think in this time that we find ourselves, we begin to understand the disciples a bit better on this Good Friday. Confused, isolated, looking for answers. The disciples were in the upper room one moment. Jesus is washing their feet. Next, they're out in the garden. Jesus goes off to pray, and what do those closest do? They fall asleep. And Jesus comes back and says, "Can't you even stay awake with me for just a little while? Pray. Pray that you might not fall into temptation." But I don't know what happens. Maybe their stomachs are still full from the Passover meal and the bread, and it makes them sleepy, and they fall asleep again.
The first reading comes from Matthew chapter 26. The betrayal and arrest of Jesus. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place, so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
The next thing they knew, Judas kisses Jesus on the cheek. One of the disciples draws a sword to protect him, cuts off a servant's ear. And Jesus stops and says, "Put the sword away." And they all run. Now they're isolated, alone, filled with guilt and shame, broken-hearted spirits. Can you imagine Peter or Judas right now? Peter, not much before this time, in the upper room said, "Even if everyone else abandons you, Jesus, I won't. Not me." I wonder if it's that love that drove Peter to follow Jesus from a distance. As they led him to Pilate's house.
Jesus before the high priest. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" But Jesus was silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?"
Peter's denial of Jesus. Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then he began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Peter outside in the courtyard. And you know what happens next? A servant girl recognizes him and said, You were with Jesus of the Galilean." But he denied it, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." And he simply brushed that off. And when he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and he said, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, he said, No, I don't know the man." And the pressure is building up now. And not long after that, huddled by the fire, one who definitely knew he followed Jesus said, "Certainly you are one of him. I saw you with him." And they began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I don't even know the man." At that moment the cock crowed, and he remembered what Jesus said. "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. When that rooster crowed, it was the most blood-curdling sound of his life. Jesus turns and looks at him, beaten, spit upon. And you know what happens when Jesus' gaze comes your way? No matter the situation, you can't take your eyes off. And he went out and he wept bitterly. Fear, feelings of being unforgiven, heartbroken. Peter finds himself alone. And what about Jesus?
The third reading comes from Matthew chapter 27. Jesus brought before Pilate. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. The suicide of Judas. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests, taking the pieces of silver, said, "It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money." After conferring together, they used them to buy the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. For this reason, that field has been called the Field of Blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of one on whom a price had been set, on whom some of the people of Israel had set a price, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me.
He betrayed Jesus. He sits with his money thinking for a while that somehow he had helped Jesus push that agenda his farther forward. Thinking people will listen to him. People always listen to him. Every time I heard a crowd, there was a hush that came over them when he spoke. But Jesus was silent. Said nothing. Did nothing. His only answer was, "You say so." And all he could ask himself was, "What have I done?" Judas, his guilt, his shame, his betrayal led him to death. And what about Pilate?
Pilate questions Jesus. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed.
Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus, Barabbas, or Jesus called the Messiah?" For he realized it was out of jealousy that they first brought him to trial anyway. And while sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a word that said, "Have nothing to do with him because I've lost a lot of sleep about this. And I've suffered in my dreams because of it." And Pilate tried more than once to find a way to let Jesus go. But ultimately, he was alone under the pressure. So he washed his hands and said, "His blood is on you," and sentenced Jesus to die.
And then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. Then they put a reed in his right hand and knelt it before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him, and they took the reed and they struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him.
The soldiers, you know what they do. They strip him, they put a scarlet cloth on him, twisted some thorns, put it on his head, beat him, spat on him, mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe, put his clothes on, and led him away to be crucified.
As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. Then they sat down there and kept watch over him. Over his head, they put the charge against him, which read, "This is the King of the Jews." Then the two bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved the others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him now if he wants to. For he said, 'I am God's son.'" The bandits who were crucified with him also taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. About 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it for him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come save him." Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and he breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those who were with him, who were keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's son." Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee.
In the middle of that suffering and shame, Jesus gave up his spirit, but not before asking forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Promising a thief that he would be with him in paradise. And Jesus said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head. Now I would bet Satan would say, "This has been a good Friday for me. Darkness has won. I put out the great light. The world is mine." And it looked that way. The disciples fled, Peter alone. Judas, in grief, dies. Pilate feels some sense of guilt and relief that the crowd was dispersed. The women cry at the foot of the cross. They've lost their loved one who had led them for so long. Yet in the midst of all that, there was one soldier who spoke the word of truth. Truly, this was God's Son, a witness on a day of darkness.
When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate ordered it to be given to him. So Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what the impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise again. Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people he has been raised from the dead. And the last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone.
The women and even us today still wonder at times who will help us. The women, they had a practical question as they waited another day until early on that Easter morning when they would go to try and put spices on. They said, "Who will roll the stone away?" It's filled with frustration and feelings of futility. Their question is also, who will take our anger away? Who will ease our fears? Who will comfort our grief? Who will take our anxieties? Who will take whatever it is that weighs our hearts down and lift it from us? Who will ease our feelings of abandonment? Jesus said, "It is finished." And now you and I know what happens next. But we do still find our times sitting in the darkness, wanting the sounds of the night to go away before the sun rises. So I remind you of one thing this night. As you pray and lift up in your prayers what darkness or weight you might feel today, may the light of Christ rising in glory dispel the darkness of our hearts and minds.
Jesus took the long way home. Jesus took the long way home. Through the garden, a courtyard, Golgotha. Jesus took the long way home. Take a shortcut, the tempter cried. Angels, God will provide, said Jesus. Shortcuts are not for me. My path must lead to that cruel tree. Jesus took the long way home. My God, is there no other not mine be done, for I'll always be your obedient son. Jesus took the long way home. Jesus took the long way home. Through the garden, a courtyard, Golgotha. Jesus took the long way home. Betrayed with a kiss on that cold dark night, his friends soon all took to flight. He was questioned, whipped, mocked, and scorned. The cock crowed twice on that lonely morn. Jesus took the long way home.
Pilate said, in him I can find no vice.
And his wife gave good advice. Fickle crowd cried, crucify. So they led him to the hill to die. Jesus took the long way home.
They gambled for his clothes on that day.
The women came to weep and pray. Sin separated, now he's so alone. It's finished, Father, I'm coming home. Jesus took the long way home. The sky grew dark, the curtain was torn. Now with his death, we are reborn. Jesus took the long way home. Jesus took the long way home. Through the garden, a courtyard,